Well, welcome back to the Missdiagnosed podcast. I'm your host, Caitlin Pyle. And man, it's been a week. It's Wednesday. It's my favorite day to record because I'm here by myself. My assistant's not working today. It's like my only day of the week that nobody's here. And I don't see anybody unless I go to the store, which I did this morning. I bought like $100 of fruits and vegetables specifically for juicing and snacks. It seemed like it was a lot of food, but that's going to last me like a week and a half. It's kind of appropriate that we're still on the emotional brain because, man, I've been feeling emotional this week. Like, I almost cried 3 times today over just stuff. I don't know. I took, confession here, a quarter of a Xanax tablet last night because I needed it. I know I say I needed it. I probably didn't. I know I didn't, but I have it. And I knew that I wasn't going to sleep if I didn't. And this is like so rare that this happens, but still I feel like a hypocrite because I'm all like, pharmaceuticals are shit, and they truly are. And I'm paying for it today. You know, it's 12:45. Normally I would have recorded and edited and finished everything with this podcast by now, but I didn't. And just a quarter of a milligram of that garbage. Sure, I slept. Did I sleep well? No. I would have rather been up all night and felt better about life and myself than have slept fitfully. I can't say it was fitfully, that's not really fair, but it just didn't really feel good. Like, everything felt muted, and I almost felt depressed. I knew it was the pharmaceutical. I knew it wasn't, and that's why I actually went to the grocery store and bought all those vegetables and fruits because I wanted to restock and try to undo what I had done to my brain by taking just that tiny dose of Xanax. It's still so strong, y'all. I mean, Xanax is a really strong thing, and to think I was on it every single day, that same dose multiple times a day during the day, yeah, and then when I got switched to Adderall during the day, which has a weird way of calming you when you're all over the place, but also not, because you're up all night. Like, I would take it at night. So I've come a long way since then, and I recognize why I was up and not able to sleep because I've been working on my TikTok, and a psychiatrist responded to one of my videos. In fact, she made a duet out of it, and she's a real sweet looking lady, you know, really wholesome looking. I think she got her training in Canada, and she's also a pharmacist. And I was making a video, you can go over on my TikTok and watch it, about how psychiatry, it was a response to someone else's comment that I wholeheartedly agreed with, that psychiatry is in business to make money. They're not there to heal people. And she's like, where are you getting this information? That's not true. I don't care about the money at all. And I was like, well, it must mean you're a unicorn. But knowing that she's from Canada, she also works for she's a children's psychiatrist. And from what I could tell, she doesn't necessarily treat mental illness, but she offers psychiatric care to children that have gone through some stuff like in the hospital, which I think that's noble, that's honorable. Couldn't find any videos talking about nutrition. I did find plenty of videos talking about pharmaceuticals, and gosh, at some point I'm going to make a response maybe this week when I have more energy and just say, like, you're still part of the problem if you're treating symptoms and not causes. That's just really what it comes down to. You're not going to solve any problem if you're just treating the symptoms of a problem. And that's what psychiatry does. And talking about how the DSM-5 was invented, or the DSM in general was invented in order to make more money, that's exactly why it was invented, to index it. At first, initially, I shouldn't say it was invented initially because it seemed pretty innocent, right? I have the DSM-2 from the 1960s. I think it was the 1960s. I keep forgetting. I know the original came out in 1952. Couldn't find that one. It was 135 pages and designed to index and give names to the symptoms that people have been dealing with. And didn't talk about treatment at all, which the DSM-5 today does not either. So it doesn't talk about the drugs. The crazy part, one of the crazy parts, is that the pharmaceutical companies are the ones who basically prescribe the treatments by inventing the drugs. They widen the threshold or lower the threshold by giving more diagnostic criteria for these disorders so more people can get diagnosed. And what's crazy is that, I love saying that, and what's crazy is that so many more people are getting diagnosed now. Mental illness isn't getting lower with the advent of all these so-called treatments, right? Nobody's actually healing. That's the problem. I did go over to her TikTok and to the duet and make a comment and say, you're an ally. I'm glad that you're not one of the ones that are just money hungry and doing electroshock treatment just so they can bill obscene amounts of dollars without even a care in the world of how brutal it is to the patient, how much it damages the brain. But there's a lot she doesn't know. I told her she should read the Saving Normal book, written by Alan Francis, who was the chairperson of the task force of the DSM-4. He was basically confessing what they were doing. The American Psychiatric Association is a self-governing authority that came up with all this stuff. They created the task force, they created the book, they make millions of dollars just on the book every year, every time they republish it with a different revision. I think now it's like the text revision is out for the DSM-5. That's the most recent one. I have it in digital version. I have the regular DSM-5 and paperback version, and it blows my mind that the psychiatrist does not know what's happening. I tagged Free Range Psychiatry, Dr. Kendra Campbell, whom I hope to have on the show very soon. Maybe she'll see an example of what psychiatrists should really be doing, because prescribing drugs is not healing anyone. Just because you get them to discharge because they're stable, right? You suppress their symptoms enough so they don't need your support doesn't mean that they're actually healthy. You're not healing anyone by giving them drugs. So yeah, continuing on in the Your Emotional Brain chapter in the Brain Saver book. Yeah, I'm excited about this portion of the conversation because we're actually talking about fighting the fire in your brain. Oxygen is one of the most important things that we need to bring to our brain every day, because without it, we can't exist. And it's because the brain is extremely electrical with all the impulses that are moving and flowing around the oxygen in the brain. So the electrical impulses are actually fed by the oxygen in our brain. Because these electrical sparks need oxygen to occur inside the brain, that means it's critical that an ample amount of oxygen enters the brain. It's also highly flammable. I don't know if you guys knew this. I needed the reminder myself, but oxygen is actually pretty flammable, pure oxygen. You can't put a flame next to an oxygen tank, for example, and then a campfire flame is going to burn hotter and brighter when it's designed to allow more air to flow in. And these same principles that apply to fire and fire next to an oxygen tank also apply inside our brain. So because the oxygen is flammable, there's other brain supplies that have to be present at the same time to prevent the electricity from overheating and getting out of control. So traveling alongside oxygen, there's water in our bloodstream that's going through, circulating around a lot of our brain, and that's partly responsible for suppressing the heat of the brain's fire, and it keeps the brain cool enough. We also rely on sugar in our blood, glucose. So I'm talking about the good kind of sugar found in fruit, because glucose also helps the brain cool down and the tissue cool down as well. It's the cells and the tissue. And that's just the beginning of how our brain keeps electrical heat under control. And the bloodstream is meant to carry a delicate balance of oxygen, glucose, water, electrolytes that are made up of macro minerals, trace minerals like magnesium, and also trace mineral salts, amino acids, neurotransmitter chemicals, vitamin B12, and healthy levels of adrenaline blends that are helpful for everyday living. So oxygen, electrolytes, and trace mineral salts keep the electricity circulating around the grid alive, right? Just like oxygen keeps us alive, it's going to keep the brain alive too, because the brain is the motherboard, right? So water and glucose cool down the sparks that create heat on the grid, the electrical grid, and it nourishes every single brain cell. That's why I have an oxygen tank in my bedroom. I needed the reminder. I'm probably going to hop in there today. I still haven't put new water in it. I think I said that on the episode last week, that I need to put more distilled water in and freshen it up and get back in there, because it can certainly help repair any damage that was done by that tiny bit of Xanax. Yeah, and neurotransmitter chemicals rely on electrolytes to keep them strong. Not just electrolytes, trace mineral salts as well. And that's why I like to drink celery juice every day, because there's a lot of trace mineral salts in there. And electrolytes, all natural, so not the Gatorade kind. Yeah, so we have to ask ourselves the question, does hydration matter when it comes to lowering the heat inside the brain? What would happen if we were chronically dehydrated? Would it be a negative thing? What about getting ample glucose, those good sugars from fruit in our diet? Does that matter? We need to ask ourselves these questions, because the truth is the brain supplies, these particular supplies for the brain are meant to occur in a very delicate balance. You have to have the right proportion of glucose, water, and oxygen. We're always breathing, so most of us are getting enough oxygen, but if we're withholding glucose and water, then the balance is off. So when people exercise or do breath work at the same time, that they're doing something like intermittent fasting, meaning they don't have the proper glucose, plus they're probably dehydrating themselves with caffeine, which is very normal. Like coffee is so trendy right now. It's always trendy, but they're increasing their oxygen levels, then they're skewing the glucose, water, and oxygen balance even more extremely. That's why I'm not a fan of intermittent fasting. You need the glucose in your brain. And having those proportions knocked out of balance means that our electrical sparks will ignite hotter and hotter, but then don't cool down enough. And we can throw off the balance of those three foundational firefighter supplies, the glucose, water, and oxygen, in a bunch of other ways too. An example that Anthony gives in the book is that it's possible to excessively drink water. If you try to drink gallons of water at once, you can actually drown yourself. I actually heard that before. Yeah. Our tendency is to override the glucose, water, oxygen balance in our bloodstream with too little glucose and water rather than too much, making the proportion of oxygen too high. But at the same time, we need the right balance of other electrical brain supplies too, including electrolytes, amino acids, the neurotransmitter chemicals, and healthy forms of adrenaline. And all these things are critical to staying emotionally balanced and strong. And I can definitely attest to this because, when we become emotional, when we get hurt or we receive bad news or we're just bummed out about something, the last thing we think about is taking care of ourselves and our bloodstream and our cerebrospinal fluid and our brains. We don't think about that. I've definitely started to think more about that. Like when I'm feeling depressed, I'm asking myself why, like biochemically, what did I do? I didn't sleep very well last night. I took a very small dose of Xanax, but that's still pretty strong. So any negative thoughts that pop into my head, I know those aren't me, Yeah, the last thing we think is, I should look for food with glucose, electrolytes, or trace minerals in it. And we don't really think ahead of time that we should prepare in case a shock to us comes. We don't really think about that. And so I think that generally what happens when people get diagnosed with things like bipolar disorder, like I did, following a tremendous shock of getting a divorce and being put in a mental hospital against my will and being left there by my husband who had just left me. It was terrifying. I wasn't prepared for that. I didn't prepare ahead of time. That's for sure. Prepare my brain for that shock. And I was smoking a lot of weed at the same time, which is making things even worse. Yeah, we go into shock and we don't eat much. I think I lost 5 pounds in 5 days at that place. We don't eat much. We don't drink much. And our brain heats up. If we start thinking, worse thoughts, like I was thinking, what if I was going to be in here forever? Like, what if he leaves me here? What if he's trying to take my business? Like all this stuff, because there's like tons of people in there and they only allow you to use the phone during a 1-hour window. So I didn't have answers and people weren't calling. Yeah, our breathing will speed up, we'll go numb, we do things to try to control our anxiety, we end up taking in a lot of air, we don't give our bloodstream what it needs to balance out that oxygen intake either, and so we go for more caffeine, which I think they did have coffee at this place, but I'm not a coffee drinker, so I wasn't really drinking caffeine when I was in the hospital, but yeah, more adrenaline in general. That really rusts out our system. It's not good for our system to have stress adrenaline coursing through our veins all the time, and it causes us to lose our glucose, dehydrate us, and take out the electrolytes in our bloodstream, and our electrical grid runs hotter than it should. It makes our situation even more difficult because we're trying to keep up this balancing act and we're already going through too much. And that adrenaline in that type of situation is way beyond the healthy levels of gentle, everyday adrenaline blends that our body is designed to produce when we're healthy. Whenever there's a problem and the brain is threatened, adrenaline is used as a backup emergency fuel. More aggressive blends of adrenaline are called for in that type of situation, especially if they're related to fight or flight stress or induced by stimulants like caffeine. Adrenaline can take over and override oxygen loss to try to keep a person alive. And Anthony has an example of that in the book, that if someone is drowning and they lose their oxygen to the brain, adrenaline will actually be released to saturate the brain in hopes that it can keep the person alive long enough to keep them out of harm's way. The adrenaline that surges through the brain when that sort of thing happens fuels the electrical fire in the brain and adds to the brain's heat. And even though electrolytes are part of what the brain's electricity needs to keep going, a lack of electrolytes can cause emotional confusion and instability. So if you've ever felt like a moment when you're dehydrated and you just feel kind of confused and dazed, like you're probably dehydrated. And that can elevate the heat in the brain too. So if your electrolytes are low, you can get into an emotional funk, and it could frustrate you, it could scare you if this happens, and then you might get an adrenaline surge, and that quick flame from the adrenaline hits your grid in your brain to take the place of the missing electrolytes, the B12, the macrominerals, trace minerals that you need. That leads the brain to burn even hotter. So yeah, another example Anthony gives in the book is if someone already has really bad anxiety and they're not eating even close to the balance of foods and liquids they need to keep their glucose and water levels high in the bloodstream, and then they go through some type of really emotional turmoil, some trauma, their adrenaline will be elevated, their glucose and water will be reduced, and their breathing will be increased, driving in more oxygen to the brain. More oxygen and heightened adrenaline creating elevated heat on the brain's electrical grid without glucose and water to suppress the heat can lead to hyperventilation in some situations, which sounds to me like a panic attack. Yeah, the electrical sparks on the grid run harder and hotter and more sporadically and can go rogue, and that brain electricity essentially becomes reckless. It becomes extra hot in the electrical grid, and it travels to places it's not supposed to travel in the brain for what's occurring in that person's life, and this can make a person feel completely overwhelmed, push them into a panic attack. Yeah, that's what Anthony says too. Or shut them down so they're less responsive and they're like laying in a fetal position in their bed, feeling like a train hit them, And maybe you've heard about breath work, because I know I have. I've been to a psilocybin ceremony in Amsterdam where we were taught a little bit of breath work. I've heard about the Wim Hof method. I did some at a retreat that I was at last year. And we're taught to use that to regulate emotions. And that's because deep breathing, it does have its value, but it's not what people think it is. They don't realize that there's such thing as too much oxygen. If you're not keeping a balance with other brain supplies, like the glucose, like salt, like water, then increasing the oxygen in your brain heats up your electrical grid, and that can be traumatizing to the brain and the body. On top of which, people are often doing breath work while consuming caffeine, and that just puts everything further out of balance. There's a lot of trends in health, and breath work is a tool for the people who are not sick at all, or not as sick, I guess. If symptoms haven't sidelined you in life, you can bring breath work in and have some fun with it, but if you're really sick, breath work is not going to fix you. It's actually really difficult for people with anxiety, and even makes it worse for people who suffer from severe anxiety, especially if you have sensitive vagus nerves, and it can cause neurological symptoms like tightness in the chest. It's not going to make lupus, Lyme disease, eczema, fibromyalgia, Parkinson's, or MS, anything like that, go away. You can bring in simple, gentle breathing techniques if they feel good to you. And you also want to make sure you're staying hydrated and getting enough glucose, electrolytes, trace minerals, and macrominerals like magnesium. And you want to try to stay away from caffeine. Yeah, so there's such thing as too much oxygen, and it's really interesting to learn about the balance between glucose, oxygen, and water in the brain, including those other supplies like the trace mineral salts. Now there needs to be a balance between them. So let's talk another thing that can fan the flames of heat in your brain, and that's fat. If someone's eating a ton of fat in their diet, they're actually losing oxygen in their bloodstream at the same time that they're losing glucose's ability to enter cells, because you're starting to deal with insulin resistance. Fat actually keeps insulin from entering the blood cells. That's what insulin resistance is. And everybody actually experiences insulin resistance when you eat a large amount of fat. You don't have to be a diabetic to experience that. And you'd think diminished oxygen means the brain's electrical grid would diminish, and it starts to until like an emergency message of sorts gets sent to your adrenal glands that causes them to release a giant burst of emergency adrenaline to thin out the fat that's throwing your bloodstream out of balance, because it wants to save your brain. It's a surge of fight or flight adrenaline that accelerates your heart rate, and that forces someone to breathe more heavily, drawing more oxygen into the bloodstream. Adrenaline basically acts like a blood thinner, and a burst of oxygen arriving from the lungs allows oxygen to get into the brain at that point. It's not likely you'd be able to feel this surge of adrenaline because it's quite subtle. It may not give off a sensation. You might feel it when you actually eat fat to lift you up. It's kind of like a type of high that has everything to do with why we can feel really good when we eat food full of fat. It causes our body to release adrenaline so the bloodstream can be balanced out. But either way, we're burning hot, hotter than ever before. We had a lack of oxygen and higher levels of blood fat with lower levels of glucose. And the emergency flare of adrenaline causes us to end up with a larger amount of oxygen and a small amount of adrenaline at once, which causes the brain to burn even hotter. So it's this like domino effect. As the adrenaline surge comes down and the system calms down, it could be hours later, blood fat fills up again in the bloodstream and oxygen levels reduce again. The heat from the extra adrenaline and oxygen that enter the brain is kept in part because we're still dealing with that insulin resistance, and that means glucose is not going to be able to get to the brain cells to the degree that it needs to in order to keep the brain consistently cool. That's why the keto diet, where they're telling you to eat nothing but fat all the time, is very, very dangerous. It's not good to eat fat all the time. You can't have that much fat in your bloodstream constantly. And I think that's why people feel good when they eat it, because it releases so much adrenaline that people who eat tons of fat are fooled into believing that they feel good when it's just their brain or their body under stress, and nobody can sustain that kind of diet long term. People don't realize that with too much fat in the diet, they're chasing a high. It's like a drug. The life-protecting adrenaline surges that they get from eating all those radical fats actually can make them think that they're making the right food choices, make them think that their cravings are justified, but in reality, the feel-good moments they get from eating their high-fat favorite foods are actually from the adrenaline, and that leaves them lost and really far from actually being intuitive about what they need. They don't know about the delicate balance of oxygen, glucose, water, electrolytes that are necessary to be in the brain's bloodstream for true support. And those feel-good moments come with a price tag, the ups and downs you feel from eating high-fat foods, that feeling you get in your brain can make you feel emotionally imbalanced. Maybe you feel oversensitive or non-caring or non-compassionate or irritable or combative or sad. Basically, you can be all over the roadmap when this type of imbalance is occurring in the brain. It sounds like bipolar, doesn't it? And the constant frustrations that this can bring into someone's life can make the fire inside the brain burn even hotter. So it's another domino effect. Things can just stack up. This can even allow for the possibility of a future stroke. Our brains are designed to be able to handle emotional blows and recover quite easily, but not when this type of internal crisis is happening to us. We develop all these hidden physical problems inside the brain that make it harder to be resilient. Yeah, so if you recall from previous episodes in this series, we can actually experience injuries in the emotional centers of the brain because of all the heat that's generated when we go through traumatizing experiences. And that can be true whether we're showing our emotions to the public or not, or to anyone. We could be holding them all inside. The injuries can still happen, and I'm certainly convinced that the traumatic experiences that I went through between 2018 and 2020 and thereafter, things didn't get better after my 2 hospitalizations in July of 2020. In many ways, they got worse. Injured my brain, because when I got this SPECT scan in March of 2021, it showed a mild traumatic brain injury that I had no other explanation for. And of course, my doctor had no idea that the emotional trauma was actually contributing to it. I really feel like I should send him a copy of this book with a letter, because, he got me on the right track in many ways, but I'm still baffled at how clueless he was and how long it took for me. It was me who was like, I want all the tests, I don't know. Yeah, so wounds, injuries in our brain influence how we think, feel, and behave, but so much of that gets labeled as mental illness. And then they give us a pill, which just injures our brain more. It doesn't actually help anything. So you can actually have brain tissue that is scorched. And when we're emotionally healing, we have to remember that our physical tissue of the brain could have been injured. It could have gotten calloused, cauterized by the intensity of the electricity that's driving into an emotional center of our brain, and that the brain tissue actually needs to heal. Brain tissue is supposed to be saturated with stored glucose called glycogen, and that's meant to stay supple and soft. Your brain tissue is supposed to be very supple and soft. It's meant to have a form of elasticity and a sponginess that is bouncy. It's not supposed to be hard. It's more difficult for electricity to run through brain tissue that's been hardened to get to the intended neurons. So when brain tissue hardens, when it gets scorched and cauterized from overheating due to an emotional injury, overheated brain electricity forms calluses and scar tissue in the brain that causes specific areas of the brain tissue to lose that spongy bounciness. Neurons can even get trapped in the hardened brain tissue. And hardening of brain tissue is most likely to occur when brain tissue is filled with toxins and poisons, and that includes what we've talked about on the show before: toxic heavy metals, petrochemicals, fragrances, MSG, and caffeine. If you're still drinking coffee, switch to decaf, or just stop drinking coffee altogether. It's going to be hard, but it will be worth it. So when your brain tissue is filled with all that stuff and it's constantly being overheated from emotional injury and high fats in the bloodstream, that's when it's most likely to harden the brain tissue. Toxic substances that saturate the brain, even without electricity hitting them, can lessen that elasticity and the supple nature of your brain tissue. In addition to that, when the brain's electrical grid hits them, the everyday toxins and the poisons in our brain make the brain even hotter, especially when glucose or glycogen is lacking, because that's what's needed to protect the brain tissue, as we've discussed so far. Electricity transforms those toxins, making them even more damaging to the brain tissue, and that means the toxins and poisons can create the beginning stages of that hardened brain tissue, although it won't be in the form of callous tissue until an emotional injury occurs, right? So when an intense emotional experience makes the heat in the brain even hotter for a specific electrical pathway, we basically got a perfect storm. It's an overheated pathway. It pinpoints electrical heat to a specific area of the brain, and if there's toxins and poisons in that same area, there's a much higher likelihood of that part of the brain tissue getting cauterized, calloused, and hardened, and also scarred, and it can even trap the neurons. Yeah, so it's definitely worth it to give special attention to toxic heavy metals, and maybe it means you need to go back and re-listen to the Battle of the Metals series, where we talk very much in depth on the chapter of the book called Your Alloy Brain, all about toxic heavy metals and the role that they play in brain heat and electrical patterns. Just as a reminder, metal conducts electricity and heat, and so when toxic heavy metals are present in your brain tissue, your brain can heat up even more, which heightens the physical injury that can occur to the brain tissue. And that means we have to be patient and proactive with our healing process, bringing back what the brain needs physically by actually following the guidance, that you're getting on the show that you can find in Anthony Williams' books. That's what I've been doing for the last year since I've uncovered all this stuff about myself. And it wasn't until May, so it's been less than a year, that I've really uncovered the information that I learned about the Epstein-Barr virus. But it was about a year ago that I discovered that I had brain inflammation, and then it became this okay, well, what's causing the brain inflammation? How can I get rid of it? And it was due to these toxic heavy metals and toxins that are in the brain and the heat patterns. They don't know. Science is way behind. And there's people out there who are just worshipers at the altar of mainstream science that has been so wrong for so many things in the past. It's so far from complete. And they shake their fist at Anthony because he's not a doctor. But meanwhile, there's all these doctors in the holistic community that have gone to Anthony to find answers when they couldn't find the answers, and they were able to solve their patients' problems with his help. So I just think there's so much to be said about who cares where it comes from if it's healing. There's no authority that owns the truth, right? If it's the truth and it's what's actually happening, and it just makes logical sense, right? Have you ever been able to read something and it just resonates differently than something that feels like it came out of somebody's ass? I don't like saying it that way, but it doesn't feel like bullshit. That's the way I felt when I started reading Anthony's book. I couldn't stop reading. The first one, I started reading it around 5 o'clock one night, and I couldn't put it down. And that was the old version. It was a paperback version that came out in 2015, and I was like, this is what I've been waiting for. This is something that entered my life in a divine way, and the words resonated as truth for me, and I felt this peace inside when I was reading the words, and there was excitement knowing that I had found the real causes of what I'd been experiencing and that it wasn't my fault. There was so much relief and hope that I was going to have my life back, and it's been an amazing 8 months since then. And a lot of times, when I have days like this where I'm just kind of feeling lower energy and forget why I'm doing what I'm doing, and in some ways, and I get frustrated because there's psychiatrists that are telling me what I'm saying online isn't true, when I have verified proof from other psychiatrists that worked on the DSM basically confessing that it is real. It's just don't even mess with me, and I'm not here to fight. I'm here to use logic. I'm here to use logic to get us to higher places of understanding and consciousness in our world, especially when it comes to health. And this is logic to me when I'm reading in Anthony Williams' books, and that's why it's important to me that I break things down so they're digestible for people, because not everybody can sit here and read a 600-page book in a weekend like me. And I was nerdy for a reason. I was put on this planet for a reason, to explain things in a way that makes sense to people, and that's what this podcast is for. So if you want to work with me one-on-one, reach out to me at hello@caitlinpyle.com. I'm going to put my email address in the show notes. I do offer coaching. We'll start out with a 90-minute session. Just email me for more details. If that's something you want to work on, I can help you figure out what steps that you need to take and come up with a plan to help you actually take action on those things, because often we know what we need to do, right? And all of the answers are really inside of us, really truly inside of us. Sometimes it just takes a little bit of guidance, and that's what I'm here for. So reach out to me me if you have any questions or if you want to get started on an intensive coaching session with me, or if you have any feedback about the podcast. Thank you for listening. We're going to continue the conversation next week. This is a long chapter. I told you it would be long, but we'll finish it up next week on your emotional brain. Thanks for listening. Thank you so much for tuning in to Missdiagnosed. If this show has helped you in any way, please consider leaving a 5-star review on iTunes. Sharing your experience will help others who are lost in the darkness find their own way out of the science of lies. Please note that while I may go in depth into medical topics and have acquired substantial medical knowledge, I am not a medical doctor. I'm a researcher. I'm a messenger of hope for other survivors of industrialized psychiatry. Because of how toxic psychiatric drugs are, it can be extremely dangerous, even life-threatening, to suddenly stop taking certain drugs. This is especially true for antidepressants, antipsychotics, and benzodiazepines. The longer you've taken the drug, the more dangerous withdrawal can be. If you want to heal your brain and soul naturally, the way it was designed to do, please seek the help of a compassionate and patient-centered physician to start the process of withdrawing from them as safely as possible. It will take time for your brain to reacclimate to life without the drugs, and there are doctors out there who will support you in your quest to save your brain. Never give up. You can heal.